Hello ladies and gents, and welcome to the Repair Lair. In today's episode of Why the Hell Do I Make My Life So Complicated by Doing All of These Things, we're taking an in-depth look at the repair and restoration of this Roland D5 digital synthesizer from 1989. As always, there's an incredible amount of material we need to cover here today, so let's not waste any time and dig right in. So here we have the Roland D5, which I can barely manage to squeeze into frame. As you can see, immediately we've got a couple of outstanding issues, starting off with one of the keys is missing, and the pitch bend and modulation stick is also missing. We also don't seem to have the power button cap, although it's not necessary, it would be nice to have. And the DC adapter is non-standard either, with a positive outside, so at least for the time being, until I get the actual one for the synthesizer, I'm using this universal charging brick. What you can't see immediately though is the fact that some of the keys are kinda sticky, so if I just press a couple of them here... Yeah, this one's particularly bad. So there's that problem. Now if I turn it on, you can see here that the battery has discharged, so it says check internal battery. And almost none of the buttons seem to be working well, so if I try to go to, let's say, A22 patch, if I click 2 and 2, so that number 2 doesn't work. 3 doesn't work. Well, 5 worked, so it did actually go to A25. And these buttons are working as well. Yeah, if I click really hard, then it sort of works. Also, the volume doesn't really work too well because the right channel seems to be kind of off, but I can't show you this right now. And out of all the keys, we have only one that's kind of slightly unresponsive, which is this one. If I don't press it hard enough, it doesn't seem to trigger. So we've got our work cut out for us, there's plenty of things to do. So I guess I need to start disassembling it. We start by unscrewing all the screws from the bottom cover and taking it off. Yuck! Just look at all this accumulated dirt. No wonder everything is so sticky here. Next, the 3 screws that hold the mainboard get removed, followed by the keyboard screws, 2 on the right and 2 on the left. Then, all the screws from the rear get removed, which releases the mainboard. Here we see the first of the 2 ribbon cables, connected by wire trap connectors. I'm marking its orientation to avoid confusion later. To unlock the wire trap connector and remove the cable, the ribbon cable is gently pulled while pressing down the middle of the connector with some tweezers. There we go, one down. And the red one comes out next. The connectors are quite stiff after all this time, so they might need some massaging to get loose. Pulling out the cable should take almost no force when the connector is unlocked, which might take a few tries. The LCD and volume adjustment cables come out next. Nothing special here. The connectors can simply be pried off with something pointy. The Keybed connectors are unlocked by pushing out the gray plastic tabs outwards, as you see here. And with that, the mainboard can now be removed. The keybed comes out next. And the front panel board is also unscrewed and removed, thus concluding our disassembly. The bottom cover of this synthesizer has been seriously corroded, so get rid of all the big chunks of rust with a wire brush. And then apply a generous amount of rust converter to stop any further damage. And once the converter has finished its job, the entire panel is thoroughly washed with warm water and soap. You can see here that the cover is actually missing its 4 feet. But I have some suitable replacements. I attached the feet to the panel with a long bolt, washer, and a nut. The bolt is then clipped shorter, because I just didn't have the bolts of correct lengths for this application. Off camera, I also sprayed the cover with some galvanizing zinc paint to protect it as best as possible. And now that everything is disassembled, it's also a really good time to clean the front panel too, which is done using dish soap, a soft brush, and some warm water. Now it's time to take care of the keybed, starting off by removing this adhesive plastic strip, which keeps the keys in place. The keys can then be removed by gently pulling them backwards and lifting up. It must be done very carefully so as to not break or bend the delicate metal springs underneath. All the springs are then collected and stored safely. Then, the key rubber contacts are also removed. And then the keybed frame also gets the wire brush and rust treatment. Note that this D5 has molded plastic rivets that hold the keybed membranes attached to the frame. These can't be removed in a nice way for reinstalling later, so I'm doing the rust treatment with the membrane in place. This really isn't ideal, but I'm being careful not to get any of the rust converter on the exposed membrane contacts. Once everything is washed and dried thoroughly, I take a softer wire brush attached to a Dremel and polish out all the contact points for the springs, particularly focusing on the worst rust-affected areas. It is important to keep all these contact points really smooth and clean to ensure good key action. Next, all the parts we removed from the keybed get washed with some dish soap and a soft brush, starting with the rubber contacts. Then, I wash the metal key springs. And finally, all the 61 keys, including the new replacement I bought online, also get washed. After thorough drying, the rubber membranes go back in place. And all the springs get replaced back into their positions. And then we reattach the keys by hooking the key under the front of the keybed, aiming the spring into the receiving portion on the key, and pushing the key downwards until it snaps into place. I then noticed that one of the keys was still slightly sticky. This is fixed by lubricating the contact point between the key and the spring. I used some plastic-safe silicone grease and spread it on the contact point using some tweezers by inserting them under the spring, thus fixing the problem. I do not recommend greasing all the keys unless really necessary. We then move on to the front panel repair. And to get to all the buttons, we first need to remove the display, which is held on by a bracket and 2 screws. Here you can see me testing some of the buttons. The first one doesn't work at all. The multimeter would beep if there was a connection when the button is pushed. And neither does the second one. The third one that I'm checking here does sometimes work, but only with a very strong push. We will therefore replace all the old push buttons with high quality new ones. All the old buttons must first be desoldered, for which I use a desoldering pump. I also desoldered some pins that I shouldn't have. Oops. Once desoldered, the buttons are still kind of stuck in their positions, so they get gently pried off with some pliers. The board then gets thoroughly cleaned with contact cleaner to get rid of any previous residue. Here's what's going on with the old buttons.
After years of service, the inside is heavily oxidized, and therefore it doesn't make a good connection anymore. And for comparison, here are the insides of a new button. What a difference! The replacement buttons are generic 2-pin momentary switches, measuring 6 by 6 by 5 millimeters. They all go into their respective positions, and the orientation here doesn't matter. Once in, the legs of the push buttons get bent, so that the push buttons don't fall out. At first, we only solder one leg of each of the buttons. When soldering, make sure to use a big soldering iron tip with lots of surface area. Let it solder and lots of heat. These old electronics really don't like to be heated for a long time. And so I personally find that soldering with extra heat and shorter overall time leads to less problems, like lifted pads. And if you're working on vintage synthesizers by yourself, be prepared to have some issues. Vintage synthesizers have vintage oxidation on the pads, making soldering kinda tricky sometimes. After soldering only one of the legs on all of the buttons, we can readjust the position of the buttons because they shifted a little bit, and then we solder on the remaining leg. And finally, all the excess is snipped off. Here you can see me removing the old volume slider. Off camera I tried cleaning it out with some contact cleaner, but sadly, no amount of cleaning could get rid of a channel imbalance and get it working without crackling. And here's what it looks like inside. The carbon traces seem to be beyond any help, they're in really rough condition, so I am replacing the old slider with a new one. The new slider also has this protective foam, which hopefully will help with longevity. The LCD screen then goes back in and gets reattached with the metal bracket and 2 screws. At this point, I test all the buttons to make sure that they click well when used behind the plastic panel. And last on the restoration list is the mainboard itself. It's all dusty, so I clean it off with a medium toughness brush. The shielding on the back also gets cleaned. I reduce the corrosion using a fiberglass brush. You can see here that the old battery has leaked and corroded, so I desolder and remove the battery holder to inspect for any damage. The battery residue is first cleaned off using a fiberglass brush, and then finished off using contact cleaner. Thankfully, it seems that, apart from some discoloration, there hasn't been any damage done to the board traces. The battery holder also gets thoroughly brushed off from any residue. And then, it is snapped back and soldered into the board. Lastly, a new CR2032 button cell battery is inserted into the battery holder, concluding all the electronic repairs. And finally, we get to the reassembly. We start off by reinstalling the front panel, making sure everything aligns perfectly before screwing it down. Then the keybed goes back in, followed by 2 screws on the left and just 1 screw on the top right for now. Next we start reinstalling the motherboard, connecting the LCD cable, and the volume adjustment cable. Then we reinstall the first ribbon cable. This gets inserted into the wire trap connector and gently pushed downwards. At the same time, the wire trap connector is unlocked by pushing down on the middle with some tweezers, allowing to fully insert the cable. And then, the same is repeated with the second ribbon cable. The new joystick gets inserted into place and screwed down, and then the remaining keyboard screw on the bottom right is also put back in. We connect the joystick cable to the mainboard, followed by reconnecting the keybed cables. The RF shield goes back in, followed by 3 screws, and lastly, the bottom cover. Finally, the remaining screws go back on the bottom cover and on the rear of the synthesizer. And here's a little taste of what the synthesizer sounds like.